All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Early Childhood Learning Community. My name is Lauren Rabinowitz, and it looks like we have a good number of folks signed on, but we are just going to give it about another 30 seconds to make sure that everyone is connected to the audio. So go ahead and while we are waiting, please type your name into the chat. Let us know where you're from so we can get to know each other, and we will get started in just a moment. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Lauren Rabinowitz, and I'm here with the TA Network, joined by my friend and colleague, Kate Wasserman, and we are so excited to get together with everyone for another early childhood learning community. We are so excited about the topic today and the fantastic group of speakers that we have to share some incredible work about understanding and appreciating the challenges and supports needed for grandfamilies and kinship families in early childhood. Since the start of this webinar series, we have tried to showcase and highlight and collectively think through all sorts of different aspects of an early childhood system of care. We have talked about policy and financing. We have talked about service implementation and all sorts of really important pieces about how the system works and comes into play. But one piece we have not yet had a chance to really delve into is some of the actual family voice and you know what it feels like to have these the really important considerations for different types of caregivers. We all know that early childhood is caregiver dependent, and so having a very specific focus and sufficient attention to grandparent families is something that we know is important no matter what system you are coming from. So we are super excited about this opportunity that we have today. Just a couple quick bits of housekeeping before we get started. All lines are currently muted. We are going to have a bit of time for question and answer after each of our speakers, and then we'll have a little bit more time at the end. I want to remind you now, and we will remind you again, we have an evaluation that we will send you a link for at the conclusion of the webinar. And we will also do some follow-up through email and also through our online system, which is called Ideas at the Institute. This is sort of an online home for this early childhood learning community where you have all sorts of really cool resources. So we encourage you to join us there if you have not already. And as I said, this webinar is hosted by the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, which is operated and coordinated through the University of Maryland. So I already talked a little bit about sort of what we've been doing through this early childhood learning community, which has been around for a couple of years now. But with the last kind of probably 6 or 7 months that we have really been doing an in-depth focus at all these different angles, not just those that are recipients of system of care dollars, but all those that are interested in creating good quality systems for children and their families. So with that, I am really excited to introduce our first set of speakers. Jaya Peterson-Lent is the Deputy Executive Director at Generations United, where she has worked since 2000. Generations United's mission is to improve the lives of children, youth, and older people through intergenerational collaboration, public policies, and programs. Jaya provides direction for the National Center on Grandfamilies, which is a leading voice for issues affecting families headed by grandparents or other relatives. She is a trusted voice on Capitol Hill on issues related to grandfamilies and intergenerational cohesion, having testified before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging and in several briefings. Under her leadership, legislation has passed to support grandfamilies in areas ranging from housing to family caregiving to child welfare. She oversees the National Center on Grandfamilies' work to provide technical assistance to states on kinship issues. Jaya received her master's of social work from Syracuse University. She's a licensed social worker who has worked in child protective services, refugee resettlement, and in many other capacities with individuals and families from a variety of cultural backgrounds. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Victoria Gray, who will be presenting with Jaya. Victoria is a relative kinship caregiver and adoptive parent and has been a foster parent to more than 40 children. She has experience working as a kinship intake specialist for a licensing agency and currently runs her own nonprofit called Gray Nickel Incorporated. The nonprofit runs a program called Kinship Help 55 that helps families where grandparents or other relatives step in to raise children when their parents cannot. She lives in Phoenix, Arizona with her husband of 40 years and 4 children still in the home. So please, Jaya and Victoria, we are so excited to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lauren, and for the opportunity to present to this group on this important topic. Again, we'll be talking about supporting grandfamilies raising children, particularly those who have experienced trauma today. So a little background on Generations United first. Generations United was founded in the mid-1980s by the National Council on Aging, Child Welfare League, Children's Defense Fund, and AARP. And it was really to look at issues that connect the generations and issues of common ground between aging and children's advocates. And soon after, we established the National Center on Grandfamilies. And when we use the term grandfamilies, we really use it interchangeably with kinship care. So we are being inclusive of grandparents and other relatives, aunts, uncles, great-grandparents who provide care for children. And through that center, we have a wide variety of resources to help the families and professionals working with the families. We provide technical assistance and training to service providers. And we do education and advocacy to policymakers to encourage supportive policies for grandfamilies. We have 2 primary websites that I will be talking about resources in more detail in a bit more, but they're gu.org and grandfamilies.org. Our work is driven by the voices and the input of caregivers and grandfamilies. We have created the Grand Voices Network, which is made up of close to 70 grandparent caregivers from across the country, representing 45 states and 11 tribes. And really the aim of the network is to have those kinship caregiver voices front and center. That if we're deciding to work on something, it is because caregivers have said this is an issue for us, we really believe we want to raise our voices in this way, and it's important. So that group guides the work of our center. And Victoria Gray, who you'll be hearing from shortly, is a member of that group. So first, a little bit more about grandfamily. Let's do the numbers. So what you have on your screen in front of you is 3 concentric circles speaking to the numbers of grandfamilies. The largest, 7.7 million, are all those children who are living in a household that's headed by a grandparent or another relative. But in these families, you might have a full-time grandparent caregiver, or you might have a multi-generational family where the parent is in the home, but so is the grandparent. Then you go to the next circle, and the 2.6 million is the number of children who are actually being raised by a grandparent or another relative or close family friend, and there's no parent to the child in the home. So we are really confident that with that group, those numbers are children being raised by relatives other than a parent. And then finally, the smallest circle is the number of children being raised by relatives without parents in the home, and those relatives are also foster parents. So the child is actually in the custody of the child welfare system. So they're more likely to be getting the support that you would get as a foster parent. You'd be connected to a social worker and some of those other supports. So what's really important about this image to recognize is that the vast majority of grandfamilies are raising children outside of the formal foster care system. In fact, for every one child raised inside foster care with relatives, there are actually 19 being raised outside the foster care system with relatives. And that's really significant because those raised outside of the system are much less likely to get supports and services of any kind to help them enroll in raising the children. We are also seeing that the foster care system is increasingly relying on relatives to care for children. When you look between 2008 and 2017, the percentage of children in foster care has actually, with relatives, has actually increased by 9 percentage points over that period of time. And we're up to close to 33% of children in foster care are in foster care with relatives. Now, we see that as a good thing because the research is very clear that when you have a relative who's appropriate and supported, that children do much better with relatives than non-relatives on the whole. But it's also very important that we are supporting these relatives. And we've seen this shift in the child welfare system moving to relatives, both because there's recognition that it's better for children, but in addition to that, because there is an increasing need for more families for children that enter foster care. And relatives are an important place to go when you're needing to find a home for children who can't remain with their parents. Why does it happen? There is a wide range of reasons that we see grandfamilies forming. You'll see substance abuse at the top of that list. It certainly ranks way up there in terms of the reason this happens. But there are a full range of reasons that we see grandfamilies forming, from death of a parent, abuse, neglect, teenage pregnancy, illness. We've seen military deployment, unemployment, incarceration, family violence, poverty, mental health issues certainly are strong on the list. The list goes on. We did mention substance use at the top of the list. We have seen with the increase in the opioid epidemic that more and more families are being impacted in this way, and grandfamilies being formed as a result of opioid use and other substance use by the parents. Particularly, we saw an increase in the number of kids entering foster care around 2012. We actually did a study that asked a number of groups serving grandfamilies outside of the foster care system the degree to which substance use and opioids was an issue. And we did find in that study that opioids were high-ranking among the reasons that grandfamilies were forming, and that opioids and substance use is the primary reason that grandfamilies do come together. We also have seen with the opioid crisis that the drug overdose rate has been rising sharply, and particularly among people of childbearing age, which means that there are children that need a place to go and to be cared for. And as I mentioned, the system is looking increasingly to relatives as a result of that. The data actually shows that more than a third of all children placed in foster care because of parental substance use are placed with relatives. So when it's a substance use issue, the children are especially likely to go to relatives when they come into foster care, and it's a substance use issue. And these children are coming with significant challenges. We don't have data specifically looking at issues of ACEs for grandfamilies, but we do have a good amount of data about ACEs for children in foster care. So if you're not familiar with the term ACEs, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And essentially what those are is it means that something really bad has happened to a person in their childhood years. And in many cases, it's something that happened by or to a caregiver, the very person that they were to look to care for them, that they are to trust to provide care for them. So there is a measure that lists a number of these types of childhood experiences that could be traumatic, and measures. There's a survey that looks at these issues and asks adults questions about whether they had these experiences in childhood. And when we look at the number of ACEs in childhood and compare those in the general population to those that are in foster care, we see really significant differences. And this is really important because research shows that the number of ACEs that one has in childhood has a really significant impact on one's health in adulthood. And so when you look, as you can see in the image on your screen, when you look at the general population, those that reported having no ACEs in the general population was about 36% compared to 1% only in the child welfare system. When you look at those with 4 or more, we had 51% in the child welfare system having 4 or more compared to only 13% in the general population. And we look at that 4 or more ACEs number in particular because that seems to be the marker where you see a real uptick in the likelihood of having negative health outcomes in adulthood. In fact, if you have 4 or more ACEs, you're 12 times more likely to have a significant negative medical health outcome in adulthood. And similarly, when you look particularly at children in foster care, you see high levels of anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems associated with that. In fact, 5 times more likely for children in foster care versus those in the general population. And while we don't have information specific for Grandfamilies on this, we do know that so often the issues impacting Grandfamilies do track similarly to those issues of kids in foster care in terms of the experiences that they have when they initially come into the Grandfamilies. They're often very similar kids with similar challenges when they have to leave their home of origin. And with the focus on early childhood, we wanted to really emphasize that when a traumatic experience happens to a child, even if it's a child at a very young age having that experience, it has an impact. And it happens very often to children at a young age. In fact, 38% of children under 3 in the child welfare system have had 4 or more ACEs already. And again, I think sometimes people think, well, you know, the child was young, so maybe they don't remember this traumatic experience. But we certainly know from research, in addition to anecdotes, that that's just not how things are. And we have this one grand member from our network speaking to this issue, saying, I thought because my grandkids were babies, 6 months, 1.5, 2.5, they weren't going to have any problems. Boy, was I wrong. They had problems with separation anxiety. It was so painful to see them go through this. I had to tell them 100 times a day how much I loved them and that I was never going to leave them. Some of the challenges that we see that come as a result of the trauma in young lives certainly are issues with attachment, being overly attached to the caregiver, fearful of the caregiver even going into the other room, or not being able to attach, not wanting to connect for fear that later they would lose that attachment, abandonment issues, stigma, feeling different. How can everybody else's parents picking them up at school? And for me, it's always my grandmother. Loss and separation issues from friends, often having to leave the home community or being separated. In other ways, of course, in Grandfamilies, there's less separation, which is a good thing typically than in traditional foster care with unrelated family members. The children may have cognitive challenges related to their experiences before coming into the care of Grandfamilies. They may also be concerned about the health of the caregiver. You have older caregivers that may have increasing health needs themselves, and so the child may have some anxiety around that. The child is often also feeling the weight and responsibility about other family members. There may be some siblings that are still not in a safe situation or have guilt or feel like they're responsible for the health of their own birth parent that might be struggling with a mental health or substance use issue. And then finally, related to that, they have a sense of having multiple loyalties. I really care about my grandmother. I also care about my birth parents, who may or may not be getting along well with my caregiver now, my grandparents, and how do I manage those multiple loyalties? So there's a lot of challenges that these young people are facing, and that can really play out in their behavior. What we know, however, is that the grandparents and other relatives really play an incredible protective role for children that have experienced trauma. And actually, I know folks in this field are really familiar with family-based protective factors. There's a number of factors that we know really play a protective role on children, even when they experience negative things happening to them. And when we did this report in 2017 that I'm referencing here that looked at trauma and grandfamilies, we found a really interesting parallel. And that is when we looked at some of those family-based, research-based protective factors, we saw that they really aligned very well with some of the research on the benefits of grandfamilies. So we grouped some of those protective factors, and you can see going parallel along them, showed how they really aligned in terms of themes. So we know that positive caregiver-child relationships and adults who model healthy relationships are a key protective factor. We also know that in grandfamilies compared to children in non-relative foster care, they're more likely to have a sense of safety, belonging, and actually report feeling loved. You see protective factors around relationships with extended family. Parallel to that, grandfamilies compared to non-related families are more likely to stay connected to their brothers and sisters and to their cultural identity. And then a last one, having a stable living environment. And we know when we look at grandfamilies compared to other foster families, they have more stability and more likely for their home to be a permanent home. So I think I've really covered much of this, but the research is very clear that when you compare outcomes for children and grandfamilies that get the support they need, children thrive in these situations. They're more likely to have a permanent home, a safe home. They have better mental health and behavioral outcomes, more likely to stay connected to brothers and sisters and culture, stability, and belonging. And I think that belonging one is particularly compelling. The research actually asked the question about whether or not you're most likely to feel loved. And those in grandfamilies reported that they were most likely to always feel loved. So that's the children. We'll move a bit to the grandparents themselves. And there is a good amount of census data research on grandparents who report that they're responsible for grandchildren. And the information that census gathers shows that more than half of them are working, still likely to be in the workforce. 19% are living below the poverty line, and folks probably know that the poverty line is very low. So even if you're just above the poverty line, you're also likely to be really struggling with meeting some of the basic needs of your family. And so that's just the percentage that's below poverty. There are many that are close to just above the poverty line as well. About 26% have a form of a disability. 43% have been providing care for these children for a good amount of time, for 5 or more years. And then 41% are actually over 60, so more likely to be retired or having some health challenges that come with being older. I also mentioned that the vast majority of grandparents are actually of grandfamilies are actually raising children outside of the formal foster care system. And we really want to emphasize that by keeping kids out of foster care, these grandfamilies are not only doing a service to children by keeping them connected to family and reducing the trauma of placing them in foster care with non-relatives, but they're also saving taxpayer dollars to the tune of $4 billion each year by keeping them out of foster care. So with that context, I'm going to stop talking a minute and turn it over for you to hear a story of an incredible grandfamily. It will be a real treat to hear from Victoria Gray, who brings both rich personal experience and professional experience to this issue. So, Victoria, I turn it over to you to share your story.
Thank you so much, Jara. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
You sound great.
Okay, great. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak on behalf of me, my family, and other grandparents that are going through this. In my case, my husband and I received 2 medically fragile children in 1993. My granddaughter was born in October of 92, and her brother was born in August of 93. But we didn't get custody of her until she was in February. So she was already like 4 months old, going through some medical issues. And so it was really hard when school started for them because they lacked so much in the intrautero where they weren't completely go the 40 weeks, so they were lacking in a lot of things like that. And both of them had drugs in their system. And so it was really hard to get services back then. The ideal of kinship, grandfamilies, none of that existed in the early 90s. And so it was a big struggle. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And just as we got settled, these children, my granddaughter was from my son, my oldest son, and the brother, they determined after he had been with us for so many months that he was not biologically linked to us. And so we had to become foster parents in order to keep him. And at that point, we fostered like 41 children. And then in 2007, my daughter gets into trouble, and we were brought a set of twins, 3-year-old, a set of twins 5 years old, and a 9-year-old, which took our family to a family of 9 overnight. We had 7 grandchildren, and then my husband and I. And so it was a lot of struggle because the older children had medical issues, and the younger set of children had behavior issues. And so it was always a struggle to find those agencies and things that could help and work with them. It took a lot of fighting. It took a lot of phone calls. And so many grandparents step up because we're not going to say no. When the state calls and say, we have your grandchildren, grandparents are not just going to let them go and be separated because there's not enough homes to take a family of 5 together. And so we step up and we do the best we can. The services are not always available that we think. And a lot of things that I tell grandparents is you must get in a support group that is the best outcome for you. You find out all the different things that are available. There are a lot of services, but the grandparents and sometimes other kinship families are just not aware of what's available. And so we go through that thing with the children, and they're having that separation anxiety. They're having the medical issues. They're having the behavior issues in school, and it's always such a struggle. So I really appreciate the different organizations and agencies that have stepped up to look at grandfamilies, because as a grandparent, my husband, who will next month turn 83, we struggled really for a long time financially and in services to help these children. We dipped into our resources, our 401k, those things just to keep the family unit together. So it's a struggle, but I wouldn't change a day of it. All of the things that we went through is important because of the family, but the support is greatly needed. So we're looking at some of the learning issues that the children have and some of the school systems that are not willing to work, or they feel it's like, it's just another foster family, those type of issues. And so we work really hard. And as a grandparent or kinship caregiver, we are advocates for these children. And we fight and get the best things for them. We help support them. But also, in my age and my husband's age, there are things that we just can't do for them. It's like bicycle riding. I'm not getting on a bicycle. I'm not going to jump rope unless there's a paramedic close by. So a lot of the medical issues and things that my husband and I go through, are not really for the children because they're active. They want to ride bikes. They want to play baseball. And so some of those organizations where we have someone that can step in and help the grand family is also great. I appreciate so much the agency like Generations United who has a voice for us, and the Institute. This is so great to get the word out. But there are so many families that just need a helping hand, and organizations and the health department, the education department, to really understand what we're going through and to give us that helping hand. I so appreciate you. Thank you so much. Jaira?
Thank you, Victoria, for your incredible story and your ongoing advocacy. I'll just give a quick pitch that Victoria is certainly putting her experiences to great use and helping so many families now back in her home state of Arizona. So appreciate everything that you're doing and your willingness to share your personal experience and story. We'll just keep moving through this section, I think, and then I know some questions are popping up in the box, and we'll get to those soon. Thank you again, Victoria. I think we hear the challenges that Victoria has highlighted, and from many of our grands. This is another grand that we, in talking about the issue of trauma, highlighted the importance of a grand family and reducing trauma for children, but also recognizing that supports and services are also needed. And this grand explains, one thing I know to be true, you can't love away the effects of trauma from neglect and abuse. Our children need the same amount of intensive therapy and services as traditional foster placement, and we as their caregivers desperately need the same help to help them heal. And I think that's so true. There's something that we often hear from child welfare programs that, well, you know, we're going to give this support to traditional foster parents, but somehow if you're just related to the child, there's magic there, and perhaps you don't need the same amount of supports and services, when we know certainly it's important. And that the caregivers are really experiencing a number of challenges, some of which Victoria so eloquently highlighted as well. And I want to talk just a little bit about grief as a collection of some of the challenges that we see with caregivers. We know that caregivers are often experiencing grief on multiple levels when they step in to raise the child. And certainly I want to emphasize that there is an incredible amount of joy that comes to caregivers with being able to care for their grandchild as well. But recognize some of the loss here. And that is, they may be experiencing grief about the adult child. If the adult child is deceased or no longer in their life, there is a grief around that. Or the expected relationship that they thought they would have with that adult child of the grandchild that they're now raising. We also see that they may be mourning the loss of what they expected as a quote-unquote healthy grandchild. If the child has a number of health issues, mental health issues, other challenges that were not in the vision of what they were expecting for their grandchild. They may be grieving the traditional grandparent role. You know, often when we think about being a grandparent, we think of being able to have the grandkids come over, feed them cookies and candy, and then send them home for the parents to take care of and do the discipline once they have their sugar high. But you can't do that when you're the full-time caregiver. You're now the disciplinarian yourself. So missing out on that traditional grandparent role. They may be grieving the loss of peer friendships. Peers are going to the movies or going golfing, and instead, as a full-time caregiver, you're going to, you know, school events and helping with homework when they come back from school. You may be experiencing grief around the expected retirement experience. So you thought you were going to be able to travel and do the different things that you wanted to do with the money that you had been saving, and instead your life course has gone a different direction. And also the financial security that you expected perhaps to have in retirement. Instead of saving for retirement, you're now saving for college, or you're spending the funds from your retirement to provide for the basic needs of those children in your care. The other challenges that we find caregivers talking about is sometimes feeling of embarrassment or feeling ashamed. Certainly we emphasize that there isn't reason for this, that this is a phenomenon that happens to many families, but this is a reality, that this is an experience that, that many grandfamilies express. Also, similar to what I articulated with the children, grandfamilies feel dual loyalties. They know that their first commitment is to protecting the child, but they also really want to be helping the child's parent to heal, to recover, to address their mental health or their substance use or whatever their challenge is, so ultimately they could return to safely parenting and building connections back with that child again. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that so often these caregivers of children are not only the key caregiver for those children, but I find that in addition to that, they are the rock of the entire family system. Often that caregiver providing for the 3 grandchildren is also taking care, bringing meals to Aunt Edna up the street, and is the one that all the brothers and sisters call to debrief or talk about some challenging thing in their life. So they're often playing not just the role of the caregiver, but also the supportive role to many others in the family. Other challenges that are the topics for entire additional webinars, but in addition to children and caregiver health, there's inadequate supportive services out there, respite. There's a ton of challenges around financial issues. Often housing is an issue because children may have come into their relative's care and the relative is living in senior-only housing, and now they need to find housing that's appropriate, larger, or appropriate for children. We often see issues related to legal custody. They may not have legal custody of the children and need to be able to consent to their medical care or to enroll the children in school. And then issues related to getting information and navigation. When we have done surveys, often next to the need for more financial support, just access to basic information is at the top of the list. It's so overwhelming to step into this role unexpectedly. And the question is, where do I start? Where do I begin? Victoria has this marvelous program in Arizona that she's been working on that really shows the important role of a peer-to-peer connection. So when a grandparent steps into this role and is overwhelmed, to have another caregiver who's been there step in, talk through it, and help connect them directly with services and truly just listen to help them take the next steps that they need to in an unexpected and overwhelming situation. So we've talked about challenges, but I also want to emphasize more the strengths. We've talked about how children do better in relative care than with non-relatives, particularly when they're supported. I think this quote from a grandson, now adoptive son, of one of the grandfamilies in our network speaks to it so well. He said, "Most people go to grandma's house and get spoiled, but for me, it was the only safe place I had. Getting to live with grandma was like going to grandma's house all the time. I had more love there than anywhere else in my life." This next slide just emphasizes again some of the more specifics of the positive outcomes that I highlighted in the graphic image earlier about the increased stability and permanency. So you'll see there where you can get the references to those specific positive outcomes to children in grandfamilies. And then I also like to speak to the fact that while there are many challenges, we do know that grandfamilies report that there are wonderful, wonderful things and joy that has come to them as a result of raising their grandchild. And so I think this quote speaks to it so well. "I feel blessed to have this boy in my life. He is a treasure, and most likely I would not be here without him. He gave me something positive to focus on rather than the heartaches and the sadness and the grief. I have a renewed sense of hope that I'm doing something worthwhile." And going along with that, one of the things we really like to emphasize with our grand families is that what they're doing is making a difference. being a grandfamily caregiver, you never know what that young life is going to turn into. And we have many, many stories of grand successes. This is just one that we like to highlight, and that is Simone Biles, who was raised by and adopted by her grandparents. It's a wonderful thing. It gives you opportunity to enrich the life of yourself and a child, explains her grandfather and adoptive father who adopted Simone Biles. And just a few resources until I hand it over to our next speaker. This is a snapshot of Generations United's website. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner this search engine here. If you have a particular topic related to grandfamilies, or if you've heard of a tool, you can type it into the search to learn more. And then under the Explore Our Topics, you can click on Grandfamilies, and that takes you to a number of our grandfamily resources. But we also host most of our grandfamilies material on this website, grandfamilies.org. And this has research not only on national research, but also you can search state laws by going into the Search Laws tab here, and you can get very state-specific information on laws and policies that affect grandfamilies. Also at that site, and you can actually get there directly through grandfactsheets.org, we have state-by-state fact sheets that lay out the numbers of grandfamilies in each state and local supportive programs for grandfamilies. So you can click on your state and get that state-specific information. Here's just a list of some of the other resources we have at Generations United. We have two newsletters. We have the weekly newsletter, which is a source of all kinds of intergenerational news, including grandfamilies. And then we have our quarterly Grand Voice, which focuses specifically on ways that grandfamilies are raising their voices on Capitol Hill, new research, resources on grandfamilies. That comes out 4 times a year. And then here's a list of some of our especially popular publications that are helpful, particularly directly to caregivers. Everything from our annual State of Grandfamilies reports to guides to raising children with disabilities, those impacted by substance use, and again, our grand successes, stories of successful people raised by grandfamilies. And I will stop there and say thank you for this opportunity to share this overview. And I'll turn it back to our moderators.
Well, this is Lauren again. Thank you so very much, both to you, Jaya, and to Victoria for sharing your story. This has been a tremendous amount of information, and lots of comments in the chat were also about how great these resources are and the way you've designed these really important facts and numbers and just packaged it so beautifully. So what a powerful story these, even just the numbers and the research tells, Jaya and Victoria. Lots of comments in the chat for you about how amazing you and your family are, and thank you for sharing that. Before we turn it over to our next presenter, we did just have 2 questions come in that, Jai, I'm hoping you might be able to chat about, and we can come back to this more later if our next speaker has something to add to it. But we had a question come in about the financial hit that grandparents often take, and there was curiosity about what some of the options and supports are for grandparents. And I think sort of the other half of that coin, separate question but related, was, what do you have ideas and thoughts on where grandparents can go for finding agencies to help support them in all the different facets of their life that you mentioned where supports are needed?
Absolutely. So certainly way up there among the challenges is the financial hit that it takes when you're unexpectedly caring for children. There's 3 major sources of financial help that we see grandfamilies typically access, but they're not necessarily available to everyone, and it's a real challenge. So one would be Social Security. If the parent is deceased, of course, there may be an opportunity for a survivor's benefit as a result of that horrific loss. If the caregiver is receiving Social Security, often what folks don't realize is there are child benefits in addition to the adult benefit that a Social Security recipient gets. So if you're caring for a child and you're getting Social Security disability, Social Security survivors, or Social Security retirement, you can get an additional child Social Security benefit. Now, these are not overwhelming amounts of money, but it's important to know that they can be available. Also, for those that make contact with the child welfare system, potentially some grandfamilies can become licensed foster parents. Now, it's a very challenging thing to do to become a licensed foster parent. Victoria can tell you she went through it. There's a lot of requirements, and not everyone qualifies, but it's certainly worth looking into if you've made contact with the child welfare system. And then finally, I think the one that's probably more common for many is TANF, so the new former AFDC program, now Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which has a different name in different states. But that is a TANF child-only grant is available to most children and grandfamilies because in most cases it does not take into consideration the grandfamily's income. However, it's not a huge amount of money. So while it's important to know that it's out there, it's not a huge amount of money. There are also some challenges with accessing that money because typically states will then go after the parent for child support, which can be a real challenge for some grandfamilies because they may fear retaliation from the parent. They may fear that the parent will come back and get the child, or they may just not want, if the parent is trying to recover from whatever challenges they're facing, they don't want to put this additional burden on the parent. So there's real issues with that. So it's certainly a big issue. It's certainly the topic of a whole other webinar, but those are quick down and dirty potential sources. In terms of accessing and getting connected with services, there was new legislation that is making possible more and more Kinship Navigator programs to be created around the country. And those are phone lines and web resources where grandfamilies can call, get an assessment over the phone, have somebody to talk to that can then connect them to whatever benefits, services, and other supports are out there. So it's taking a while for them to get up and running. Some states have them. We certainly direct you to our grand fact sheets to learn what's out there now, but we will be updating those as more and more Kinship Navigator programs sprout up around the country in the near future.
Hi,
Really helpful. Victoria, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I did want to jump in there and say that part of my nonprofit helps families in the very beginning because we also have a nonprofit that helps families. So when you first get the children, there's an organization that helps you with the beds, and they give them beds and sheets and clothing. There's also an organization that does clothing for the family. But the biggest problem that our kinship families run into is how do you ask for what you don't know you need? Or how do you ask for what you don't know it's out there? And so a lot of times our families are spending anywhere from $500 to $1,500 within the first 2 or 3 weeks buying beds and clothes and school uniforms when we can connect them with agencies that can get that stuff for free. But in the meantime, the families have depleted their savings account. I came across a grandmother who, not mortgage, but took a title loan on her car at 32% interest to get the things that her child needed. And she's never going to be able to pay that back. So it's getting the families connected with the agencies and things that are out there who have services that can help them. And we shouldn't have the grandparents or the kinship families trying to remember or try and think about what they need before they spend thousands of dollars in that first month of placement. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow, the complexities and the layers of these issues are really, really tremendous. So we will reserve some more Q&A time a little bit later in the presentation, but right now I'm going to invite Kate to introduce our next speaker so we can hear about another fantastic program.
Thank you. This is such an incredible and important conversation. We really appreciate everyone's time and attention and your stories and expertise. As Lauren and I were kind of trying to design this hour and a half with you all, we thought about, certainly pulling in the national and advocacy expertise of Jaya and her work at Generations United. We were thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from a grandparent specifically and have Victoria tell not only her advocacy work but also her personal perspectives, but also wanted to have the opportunity to hear from a clinical team working directly with grandparent-led families, and we happen to have a really fantastic team right here in Baltimore City. So I have the honor of introducing Catherine Green, who's the clinical faculty field instructor at Family Connections, which is part of the University of Maryland School of Social Work. And in her role there, she is responsible for providing direct services to children and families, applying evidence-based practices and intervention strategies across all three Family Connections models. She has a Master's of Social Work from the University of Maryland School of Social Work, a Master's in Educational Psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a Bachelor's in English Literature from the University of Michigan. She has extensive work experience in elementary school and research settings, including as a lead teacher, an administrative assistant, and a research analyst. And in addition to providing counseling services at Family Connections, she supports grant applications and research reports for the program. So I'm gonna pass the mic over to her.
Great. Thank you so much to Kate and Lauren for having me. I'm so grateful to be here. So good afternoon, folks. My name is Catherine Green. I'm a clinical faculty instructor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and I'll be talking today about one of the university's community-based programs where I work called Grandparent Family Connections. As Kate said, we're a program of the University of Maryland School of Social Work, the Social Work Community Outreach Services. We develop, implement, and test community-based family services that support vulnerable families to achieve their safety, permanency, and well-being. Just as I'm getting started, I want to thank our funders and partners that allow us to do this work with Grandfamilies. We are reliant on their support to continue supporting grandparents in Baltimore City. Our funders are the Department of Human Services, Family League of Baltimore City, SAMHSA, and many private contributors. So I'll start with just an overview of Grandparent Family Connections. We're an in-home family therapy program in Baltimore City. There are kind of three main components of our programming. The first is family therapy. The second is providing concrete resources. And the third is really intentional advocacy efforts for families. We're a 3, 6, or 9-month model. Typically, we see families once a week for 60 minutes or longer. We can see caregivers individually, families together, or children individually. There's a lot of flexibility embedded in our program, and part of that is because in response to community need, but we're also grant funded, which means that we can provide a free service, and we're not tied to insurance fees. This allows us to kind of navigate systems with caregivers in a different way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But also so we can be accommodating about how and when we meet with families and allow them to see additional providers that might bill for services if needed. So I just want to share a little bit about the context of Family Connections. We follow kind of the main tenets of implementation science, especially when we test and adapt our three models. We know that implementation science asks programs to specify problems before designing ways to address them. But as community-based social workers, we also know that the context of the social issues in our communities is so very important. So when designing Grandparent Family Connections, we really took stock of the context of the city and some of the systems grandfamilies become involved in. So we know that families in Baltimore City are impacted by discriminatory social policies. Some examples of these are housing segregation and redlining, a state-sanctioned police force that's not locally controlled, chronically underfunded schools. We also know that families are impacted by what we call a hyperactive child welfare system. So when we say hyperactive, we really mean a system that was traditionally designed to intervene with families after they were struggling to meet their children's needs, often relying on out-of-home placements. I appreciate Jaya's point earlier about how this trend is starting to flip. So for generations, though, we saw out-of-home placements impacting attachment with caregivers, leading to emotional and mental health issues down the line. We also know that grandfamilies are impacted by a lack of anti-poverty initiatives, and we believe in Baltimore we need to keep kind of the 4 primary components of complex trauma in mind from an intergenerational perspective. Just a little bit about our model history. We were founded in 1996 by Drs. Diane DePanflis and Dr. Howard Dubovitz. We owe them a great credit for acknowledging kind of an alternative pathway for families at risk of child abuse and neglect. We are primarily a model designed to prevent recidivism within the child welfare system by preventing child abuse and neglect or intervening with families before child welfare involvement. In 2003, Family Connections adapted and tested grandparent family connections. And then in 2007, the team adapted and tested trauma-adapted family connections. All three of our models we've really focused on evolving our thinking around partnership with families, building power within a community, and addressing unmet needs. This slide illustrates our conceptualization of the factors we believe impact outcomes for family permanency, safety, and well-being. So we categorize risk and protective factors similarly to how Jaya presented earlier, which I think will be a theme for how I continue. But safety and well-being are often thought of as being kind of on the same continuum, well-being on the right, safety on the left. So we believe unless you address safety and permanency, it's pretty difficult to achieve family well-being. I will admit that we struggle a bit with defining well-being as a program. I'd say that well-being is kind of a state of being comfortable, happy, and healthy. Well-being is a place where families are afforded good, safe living conditions, housing, and employment. They're able to access all their human rights. But we know that this definition doesn't acknowledge historical factors, and in our eyes, well-being must be revised by family histories and individualized within their social context. So this means that to achieve well-being, we've begun much more advocacy efforts around grandparent issues in Baltimore City and across the state. We have a fantastic caregiver advisory group that has provided testimony at general assemblies, shared their knowledge on public radio, and generally acted in community with each other around their needs. So this really allows our grandfamilies to dictate our programming and where we put the institutional power from the University of Maryland behind good policies and practices. In this way, I want to make sure we acknowledge that we have an evidence-based model, but we're still learning and evolving and hoping to do so with grandparents leading the way. Like I said earlier, Grandparent Family Connections is a neglect and abuse prevention program. And while neglect is commonly used to illustrate kind of quote-unquote the failure of a parent, our assumption about neglect is that it represents a systemic failure to provide affordable housing, fair wages, safe water, and we approach our work from that ecological space. I just have some additional information about child neglect, but the real bullet point I want to highlight is that neglect continues to be the #1 category of child maltreatment in the United States. So we see this trend now more in part because of the rising gap in wealth accumulation and the number of children living in poverty. So again, in our model, we really view neglect prevention as a systemic approach to intervening with individuals and families. Again, this is why advocacy is such an important part of our work. So clinically, we really think it's appropriate to intervene on a family level and connect that work to a systems narrative. By allowing space for caregivers to advocate for their needs, both on a policy and programmatic level, we hope to move the needle on systems designed to support grandparents. I appreciate that Jaya introduced this earlier. At Grandparent Family Connections, these risk factors are what we assume will increase the threat of child abuse and neglect, but we also know that protective factors act as mediators for child safety and well-being. So we approach each factor again from an ecological standpoint, and often we ask both ourselves kind of internally, our research team, and especially our caregivers, how are these different levels, these different systems levels intervening to undermine or protect children? Some examples of risk factors. I know Jaya already gave a few, but I'll be quick. But some of the ones that we see most often in Baltimore City include chemical dependency, caregiver depressive symptoms, everyday stress, parental views of child behaviors. There are broader social and community risk factors too, of course, lack of public investment in communities, lack of mental health programs. Some examples of protective factors that I think are not typically often named in the literature are parenting attitudes like the perceptions around the enjoyment of parenting or capacity for empathy, parenting competence, such as recognizing where a child is developmentally and responding accordingly. These are characteristics that we see as really promoting resilience and that moderate a lot of these risks. These slides just have some additional information about grandparent-headed households. I just want to note the third bullet, which is that in Maryland's 7th Congressional District, where Grandparent Family Connections is located, we find the highest number of children under the age of 18 living in households where a grandparent provides that child's primary care. So roughly about 550 children in our district are living in their grandparents' care. And I'm just remembering Victoria's words about the need for more programming. We're really the only program in Baltimore City designed to support grandparent families, and I think this number is a really nice way to highlight the need. Again, I'm just grateful to our previous presenters for sharing data around the significance and importance of kinship care and grandparents. You'll see a little bit more here about the trends involved in those households. And a little bit more about our guiding principles. We start with an ecological developmental framework that's really coupled with community outreach in our neighborhood. So we're often in school, child care centers, mental health centers, pediatric offices. We do a very comprehensive assessment of the entire family in the first 45 days of services. And when I say the entire family, that includes folks who may not be living in the home, but who kind of come in and out of services. And then we provide tailored interventions designed to support the family's unique needs. We really take special care to focus on a helping alliance with a family, and that's typically using an empowerment and strengths-based approach. We're certainly aware of the cultural implications of system-involved families. We acknowledge all systems of oppression and their impact on families during our clinical work. And we make sure that our service plans are outcome-driven and focused on families' needs. As they dictate them, families are really driving those 3, 6, or 9 months. So we know that grandparent caregivers, thanks again to Jaya and those amazing foster care slides, we know that grandparent caregivers are a growing trend in family care and kinship care. So this is especially true in child welfare work, not just at the policy and program level. And as we mentioned previously, grandparent-headed families are complex, even at the start of caretaking. Grandparents can take on the role of caregiver abruptly due to a variety of reasons, parent transitions, death, or incarceration. In other cases, grandparents may assume a caregiving role more gradually, providing care intermittently before assuming full caregiver responsibilities. There are many challenges at play for grandparent-headed families, especially families more impacted by white supremacy and disinvestment. Many grandparent families are more likely to live in poverty and require long-term care. As family needs increase, grandparents can grow in social isolation, depression, and physical health concerns. I wanted to share just a little bit about what this looks like in practice at Family Connections. So I've recently been working with a grandparent caregiver who gained care of her grandson after her own son was incarcerated. Her grandson was being treated for lymphoma in Florida, and when his father was incarcerated, she went to Florida and spent her savings to transport him to Baltimore City. I'm grateful to Victoria for her example of how kind of those first initial days with a grandchild can be really financially depleting. And when I met this grandparent, her worries and concerns focused on maintaining financial stability, supporting her grandson's health needs, and adjusting to being in a, quote, parenting role again. I'm also grateful that our model includes meeting concrete needs within the first 45 days. So we ask families for a kind of informal financial assessment in order to better understand how we can support them financially, with stability and safety right off the bat. So for this particular grandmother, we were able to make 1 month's mortgage payment, buy her grandson a new bed, and pay for part of his summer camp for children with cancer. I think what I really want to highlight is that these financial decisions are very intentional. Paying the mortgage allowed this grandmother to get ahead in other financial ways, for example, paying her electric bill. The new bed allowed for increased physical health for her grandson, and the summer camp afforded some respite from caretaking. After the initial 45 days, and after assessing for family needs outside of concrete supports, including family trauma history, the focus of services became the grandson's trauma response. He had experienced physical and emotional abuse from his father, which was manifesting in his behaviors with his grandmother. This continued to overwhelm and burden her. I know, again, Jaya and Victoria have both talked about these a little bit, but there are some common themes here that I just want to highlight in our clinical work. Grandparents often hold great ambiguity about their role, which causes intergenerational strain. They're caught between caring for a grandchild they don't want to lose to a foster care system, and they also wish to assume the role of a traditional grandparent, retired, enjoying time with their grandchildren, and then giving them back to parents at the end of the day. I think this ambiguity shows up in many ways. A hesitancy to gain custody because it will impact the parent, a conscious or non-conscious desire for the grandchild to return to their parents, and an exhaustion of being put in between a child who's really making meaning of their parent's situation and a parent where communication may be strained. At times, grandparents allow the parent back into the child's life at an emotional cost, and then the desire to gain custody or take over caregiving is renewed. That can be a cycle. Another theme includes the difficulty in gaining systemic support. Many grandparents rely on Social Security for their income, and if they're caring for a grandchild informally, they aren't able to access many additional financial supports, as we've just talked about. If they do apply for custody, they can be presented with complex legal situations around adoption and legal care. We also know that many children with emotional and behavioral needs end up in grandparent care. Typically, we find that these needs are related to a trauma history or separation from their primary caregiver. For grandparents who are already carrying ambiguity and anxiety about becoming the primary caregiver again later in life, managing their emotional responses to children with higher needs can be very hard. In the example I shared earlier of the case that I'm working with, many of the initial work with the grandmother involved kind of a clearer understanding of what trauma behaviors entail and how they manifest in younger children. So shifting the shared meaning of her grandson's experiences involved working on his emotional safety in the home and allowing a greater understanding of the grandson's experiences outside of the lens of defiance. I think that's it for me. I'm so grateful for your time and attention, and we might take questions now or maybe in a little bit. Okay.
So now we want to pause just like we did after Jaya and Victoria's presentation and offer folks to either type in or unmute and just ask any questions specific to the Family Connections and Grandparent Connections work here in the city. We have some folks typing. As their text is coming in and we're waiting, I'll say I really appreciated, Catherine, how you were able to really share the sort of the values and logic behind the way that you engage with grandparents, and so that it's not just focused on problem solving or case management, but what's the sort of value that we're trying to instill behind the work that you do. It was really powerful.
I'm very grateful to Victoria for pointing out this kind of desire for like group building or sort of like space building with grandparents. I think that's something we keep pushing a lot at Family Connections, is how can we bring grandparents to the policy table? How can we bring grandparents to the mayor's office?
Yeah.
How can they have so much wisdom, and many of the grandparents we work with have lived in Baltimore City for their whole lives. And they know the city like the back of their hand, and just trying to push their voice in that policy agenda.
Absolutely. So we have a question. Stefan Evans asks, is the grandparents' health taken into consideration when it comes to them being able to take care of the child?
So I think we serve grandparents regardless of custody. So we see grandparents who have taken in grandchildren at all ages and stages of health and physical health and emotional health. We certainly take that into consideration when we're planning clinical interventions and when we're planning services. I think part of that includes kind of connecting with the Department of Aging and the Department of it's Aging, and then there's Adult Services, which kind of has in-home services for older adults or aging adults. And they can typically provide some case management, and I know that they certainly connect grandfamilies with outside services. I'm not sure about their financial support, but I know that because we think holistically about families, health is a huge piece, so we always include that in our clinical work.
That's a great point. I really like how people are thinking both about the sort of physical and emotional and financial and health-based burdens on grandparents. And it's not just, it's about supporting them to support the kids and families in there.
Kate, but before you move on, it's so very, what's the right word? I mean, it's so parallel to when we talk about the early childhood system of care. I mean, it's these same complementary groupings of areas of need and support. It's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just like the opportunities, I'm wondering if any of the three of you could speak to, to your point, Catherine, not just about elevating grandparent voices when they're able to be champions for things, but also just connecting them to peers. It sounds like that's a really important initial thing. I know, Victoria, you touched on that lightly, but I wonder if that's part of what you see happening in the city or you guys see happening across the country.
I can't. Go ahead, please.
Well, in my program where I have nonprofit, I go in with the families and I meet with them within the first 24, 48 hours. And I've been really, it's one thing to know my situation. It's another to hear someone else's story, and you figure that they were going through so much and how can you help them. And I've had grandmothers who have just held my hand and cried because it was the first time they were able to tell their story. Their story of how they've taken in these children, their grandchildren, and how they've had to give up the connection with their biological children in order to keep their grandchildren. You know, those type of stories are really heartbreaking because you gave birth to this child, but now because you're helping their children, you can't keep that connection with your own biological children. And even the children that your biological children that you are not helping with their grandchildren, you miss that grandparent connection with those children because your time is spent with the ones that live in your home.
Right, right. I recall when I was doing clinical work with a couple of grandparent-led families where also it felt like they had to navigate all of that and like setting boundaries, like if the parent was involved in some way, like they had to navigate all of that on their own. It felt very heavy for them.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I can't tell you the number of family caregivers that have told me that connecting to a support group is a lifeline to them. I mean, I've had grandfamilies say it literally saved my life. So just being able to connect with others that have been there, there's a sense of trust, there's a sense of comfort of telling my story, and learning from each other. They're incredible resources. The best information comes from those that have been there. So connecting to a support group is really, really critical. And that information, you can learn about support groups through those grand fact sheets that I highlighted earlier. They're not everywhere, but there are many. And then there's also some online resources if folks are in a part of the country where there's not one that they can physically go to.
I think one thing that we've tried to do at Family Connections with our caregiver advisory group is, because systems are so siloed, we have tried to stay kind of centralized as a hub for outside providers to come in and share their services with our group. So that includes like the energy company who came the other day, mental health providers, pediatricians, so that grandparents don't have to kind of fan out throughout the city. And they can be present with us, and we can kind of serve as a centralized space for those learning about those services.
I think another big trend that we've been talking about, to Lauren's point, around early childhood systems as well, is this idea of needing to knock down so many of those silos. That the burden is so high for families, and especially for grandparents who, you know, as all of these stories have highlighted today, you know, often have to unexpectedly be ready to act very quickly to onboard whatever's happening for the kids that come into their care. So we have one more person who's going to speak to this topic today. We've packed a very full hour and a half, but I hope a meaningful one. Her name is Tish McGinnis, and she is the steering committee chair for the National Early Childhood Family Network. And we're going to hear a little bit about their work right now.
Well, okay then. Can you hear me? I hope. Okay. The National Early Childhood Family Network, and may I just say how thrilled we are to be a part of this presentation that went on today. It was just marvelous and just right at the heart of what our hope is for being able to form our National Early Childhood Family Network. And let me just share, we came together, there were 55 family members from across the country and territories that were invited by SAMHSA to come and attend a Family Leadership Summit. The reason for them inviting us was that we are parents, we're grandparents, we're caregivers, and we want to make a difference for our children and families that we all work with. So as we got together, one of the things that we ended up walking away with was being able to form this National Early Childhood Family Network with the desire that anybody and everybody could join us. And this group, for the past year and a half now, have been working very, very hard to get the word out that it's open to anybody. The only requirement was to be, has been, or will be a parent, and that you can join us on our mission and our vision. And what we wanted to do was be able to share with you, and I'm going to jump to just, wanted to be able to share our mission, but I don't know where that slide went to, and I'm going to apologize that I don't have it memorized. But our goal is that we are able to provide resources and do just exactly this. We've had a couple of webinars through our technical assistance program with SAMHSA, and it's afforded us the opportunity to invite our parents to watch and be a part of this. And we have a very short video that we would love to share with you at this point, and I think they're going to set that up for us. Thank you.
So just a couple of instructions before we navigate to the video. For folks that are joined by telephone, you want to go ahead and sit down your telephones and unmute your computer speakers. The video's audio will play through the computer. So please, if you are connected by telephone, go ahead and sit down your telephones and unmute your computer speakers. And I'll give folks about 10 seconds or so to get prepared.
Most of it is that we all started by telling our story. And so when you tell your story, think of the goal that you want, whoever's listening to it. Craft your story, because each of you have a powerful story.
Project Launch is very important to our children. With my grandson, that there were more grandsons, more kids like him and stuff. So I became a parent leader to be able to gather knowledge. Knowledge is power.
With my own daughter, I was powerless because she was struggling.
Nobody has a right to tell me or tell any child in the world that you do not have solutions.
I was always being told, you discipline at home, you discipline in school.
And we built a network, we built a coalition within the school, and we unseated the board and took over the school. But then you translate that into creating a movement to affect change on the community level.
We set out to create this forum for family leaders to come together and really explore what does it take to lead, who are you as a leader.
The first question is always not what's your vision, is what is your mission.
We want to equip families to have knowledge and skill to deal with social emotional development.
Being able to take the perspective of the child and carry that through.
I engage parents and family on their level, not my level.
Locking in those networks.
Action-oriented. In your helpful network, you need to have purpose.
Advocacy really is, how does it make you feel?
You need to have clear goals.
We made a list of things that we're going to need to purchase, supplies.
And you need to make sure you have the right team, like the right people on the bus. But we want parents in their story, but I want a parent who's a grant writer. We need to maximize our family members for that other thing that they have. A lot of us parents are all trying to do the same thing individually. And you may have the idea, this person may have the details, this person may know how to get the money, this other person may be good at getting feet on the ground. And as you use and you bring all these people together,
you will be infinitely more powerful.
Open up your text.
What one word, what do we want for our young children? Type that in.
And people said that we were nobody. But when we came together,
Okay, so for folks that are connected by audio, by telephone, just be sure to go ahead and put your computer speakers back on mute and to pick back up your telephone.
Okay, great. And while you're all doing that, I'm going to just add that some of the things that we are trying to do is, like we had mentioned, we've had a webinar series. We have a wonderful newsletter that we'll be more than happy to share with you. And we are working on trying to make family connections by setting up some regional family connections. And so, again, we would love to be able to share some of these things with you. All you need to do is contact me, or if you know of somebody that is already a member of the National Early Childhood Family Network, or you can send us an email, and our slide is there that gives that email address, or please feel free to call and ask for Tish, and I will be more than happy to gather up some information and pass it on to you. And again, this was a wonderful presentation. We are thrilled to come and share that this is a network that is trying to get started for everybody that was watching and is a part of family direction, whether or not you're a parent, whether or not you're a grandparent, or about to be. And I think with that, I'll let you forward the next slide. Or
Wonderful. I think that is all of our packed content for the day,
okay.
But just want to offer, if folks have any questions specifically for Tish about the work of the family leaders, or or just sort of thoughts or closing comments. Lauren and I obviously have a busy job to sort of package all of the resources that were referenced today in a follow-up to you guys, and you'll get that pushed out both through the constant contact that we do, as well as through the actual ideas platform. And you're seeing here a link to the webinars related to the Family Leadership Learning Community. So thank you, Tiara, for posting that. But we'll just offer in the last minute or two any closing comments or thoughts. People can pour those in.
Thank you so much. This is Lauren. Just want to say not only a huge thank you to all our presenters, but also to those of you that were participating in the chat and sending along resources. That really helps make this such a rich opportunity. So thank you to you all as well.
All right. Well, seeing that no typing bubbles come up on the public chat currently, we'll be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for the many of you that hung in for this entire content, and as Lauren said, for those of you that offered your perspectives and a little bit about your work. Lots more to come.